page 91, first verse, fourth verse. Silent night, holy night. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright, round yon virgin mother and child. Holy infant, so tender and mild, sleep in heavenly peace, sleep in heavenly peace. Silent night, holy night, wondrous star, lit thy light, with the angels let us sing. Alleluia to our King. Christ the Savior is born. Christ the Savior is born.
Thank you again, Jimmy. If you have your Bible, you turn to Leviticus chapter 1, and we're actually going to get to Leviticus chapter 1 tonight. We'll cover probably a chapter a week from here on out, or what we're going to try to do. If you remember, we left off last week, I told you about the sacrifices. God instituted the sacrifices, and they were for specific purposes. God designed the sacrificial system to teach Israel. It's a teaching tool because He wants them to learn some things. So because it's a teaching tool, it has a regulatory and a revelatory principle aspect to it. It first of all reveals our sin and our defilement. That's the whole purpose. And then the act of actually sacrificing is revelatory because it shows how that a sinner can come clean before God. So God designed this system just to say, first of all, you got to identify that you're a sinner, and then second of all, you have to figure out that there's a way to get back to the Lord that's a right way, and there's a way that's a wrong way. So that's the reason He designed it. Now, it's kind of like, if you ever, the first 7 chapters of Leviticus, let me just say it like this, are designed to cover 5 basic sacrifices. The first 3 are what we call sweet aroma sacrifices. They are worship sacrifices. And the last 2 are expiative. They're designed to cleanse us. They're designed to take care of iniquity and sin. And so the first 5 chapters, we're going to look at each one of them. Chapter 1 is on burnt offering. Chapter 2 is on meal offering or grain offering, some Bibles call it, or some people call it. Chapter 3 is on the peace offering. Then chapter 4 is on a guilt offering. Chapter 5 is on a sin offering or an iniquity offering. And then chapter 6 is all about just kind of a summary of the 5 sacrifices and what God intended to do with them. And in chapter 7 is basically the priest's role in the sacrifice. What does the priest have to do? So we're going to break all these down. They are these first 7 chapters, though. Let me give you a little caveat up front. If you ever read the genealogies in Matthew and Jesus, they're good. They give us information, but they're not complete. They don't tell us everything. So when you look at the sacrifices in Leviticus, I don't think it tells us everything to do with the sacrifice. In other words, there's some things that the Israelites probably did that we don't have a record of. But what they show us in these first 7 chapters is all that's really required, if that makes sense. There's extra things they probably did, but all you need to know is what's in here. It's not all that there is to know, but it's all that we need to know. And I'll kind of explain as we go. They're voluntary. All these sacrifices are voluntary in the sense that there's no really law requiring. There's no obligation to do it. God commanded them to do it, but there's no penalty. God's not going to kill them if they don't. Doing the sacrifices is basically just a way of saying, I believe God. I want to serve Him. I'm going to be obedient to what He says, so I'm going to do them. Now, let me just make this comparison to you. There were probably, and I don't know these ancient Israelites. I've never met any of them. There were probably some hard-hearted Israelites that didn't do it. They're voluntary. In other words, they're worship offerings. You bring these offerings because you want to worship God. And so it's voluntary. God said, I want you to do this, but I'm not going to strike you dead if you don't. But by doing it, you draw closer to the Lord, and you show God that you're going to be obedient to what He wants you to do. Now, there's some probably hard-hearted Israelites that say, I'm not fooling with that. It's too much trouble. Just like there's some Christians today that don't do what God asked them to do. They don't praise. They don't serve. They don't pray. They don't do the things that God's not going to strike you dead if you don't pray, but you don't draw closer to Him if you don't. They're voluntary things. God said, here's the way you do it. If you want to draw closer to me, you pray, you read the Bible, you meditate, you have quiet times, you serve people, you go to church. I'm not going to kill you if you don't, but you're never going to draw close to me if you don't do those things. That's the way these sacrifices work. They're designed to teach Israel that if you want to get in right communion with God and want to get in a good fellowship with Him, this is the way to do it. And so God outlined these 5 sacrifices. Now, they're kind of ranked in a group of 3 and in a group of 2. The first 3 are worship sacrifices, but out of those, the first 2 of them really involve people's commitment to God. In chapter 1, we're fixing to read all about burnt offerings. In chapter 2, next week, we'll read about grain offerings or meal offerings. They are about your commitment to God. In the third one, in chapter 3, is a peace offering. The peace offering tells us all about our communion with God. So the first 2 is going to say, because you want to be committed, this is what you do. The third one is going to say, if you want to have communion with Him, really want to be in fellowship with Him, this is what you do. The 4th and the 5th ones are all about, since you're a no good sinner, this is what you have to do to make it right. It's their expiation sacrifices. They get rid of the sin that we're guilty, and we bring them before the God. Now, each one of them, even though they're different sacrifices and different purposes, each one of them have some things in common. Basically 3 things. Number 1, here's what you're going to find: they all have an offerer. That somebody's got to bring the offering. All right, it's pretty common sense. It's pretty standard. But every one of these, you're going to see where God directs somebody to bring the offering. The priest can't do it. Somebody has to do it. Just like now, people, and I use this comparison, and I don't mean to be ugly when I use this comparison, but some people think that the pastor or the deacon or Sunday school teacher is supposed to do all the praying or all the visiting. We do our part. We pray and we visit and we serve and we do, but it's our part. But everybody else has a part to do too. And so these offerings were designed that the priest really can't do it. He's going to have a part in it, just like a pastor has a part in services. The priest will have a part, but it's an offerer that has to bring it. Number 2, there has to be an offering. In other words, there has to be an animal or an object to sacrifice. And you're going to see, we're going to go through these one sacrifice at a time. God specifically ordained certain things to be sacrificed. Certain animals that you can use, you can't. Certain birds you can and you can't. And matter of fact, when we go through this burnt offering, there's a certain way you have to slaughter the animals, and there's a certain way you have to handle the birds. God gave them a requirement for how to do it. So there's an offering. There's a voluntary offerer who comes with a designated offering that God has told him. And then the third thing in here is there's a mediator. In all these sacrifices, the priest will step in and mediate. He didn't do it, but he mediates it. Even though that they are different, the priest is still involved to a certain extent. Now, the first three, like I said, are worship. They theologically call them sweet aroma sacrifices. They're pleasing to the Lord because they show God and they tell God and they demonstrate to God that we want to bring a sweet sacrifice, and it's a sweet act of service. And so that's what those are. The second two, or the last two, the 4 and 5, are what they call non-sweet aroma sacrifices. In other words, there's no really pleasant about them. It's a mandatory thing because you're a sinner. And if you want to clean up the sin, you have to do it. There's no really worship involved in it. It's, I did wrong and now I've got to pay the penalty for it. That's what those are all about. All right, so that's what these 5 kind of share in common. Let's get right into chapter 1. Again, chapter 1 is just burnt offerings. And let's read this whole chapter. Then the Lord called to Moses, and they all start like this. God is talking to him. The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, When any man of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of animals from the herd or the flock. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall offer it a male without defect. He shall offer it at the doorway of the tent of meeting, that he may be accepted before the Lord. He shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, that it may be accepted for him to make atonement on his behalf. He shall slay the young bull before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priests, shall offer up the blood and sprinkle the blood around on the altar that is at the doorway of the tent of meeting. He shall then skin the burnt offering and cut it into pieces. The sons of Aaron, the priest, shall put fire on the altar and arrange the wood on the fire. Then Aaron's sons, the priests, shall arrange the pieces, the head and the suet over the wood which is on the fire that is on the altar. Its entrails, however, and its legs he shall wash with water. And the priest shall offer up in smoke all of it on the altar for a burnt offering, an offering by fire of a soothing aroma to the Lord. That's why they call them sweet aromas or soothing aromas. But if his offering is from the flock of the sheep or the goats, for a burnt offering he shall offer it a male without defect. He shall slay it on the side of the altar northward before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priest, shall sprinkle its blood around on the altar. He shall then cut it into pieces with its head and its suet. The priest shall arrange them on the wood which is on the fire that's on the altar. The entrails, however, and the legs he shall wash with water, and the priest shall offer all of it, and offer it up in smoke on the altar. It is a burnt offering, an offering by fire of a soothing aroma to the Lord. But if his offering to the Lord is a burnt offering of birds, then he shall bring his offering from the turtle dove or from the young pigeons. The priest shall bring it to the altar and wring off its head, and offer it up in smoke on the altar. And its blood is to be drained out on the side of the altar. He shall also take away its crop with its feathers and cast it beside the altar eastward to the place of the ashes. Then he shall tear it by its wings, but shall not sever it. And the priest shall offer it up in smoke on the altar, on the wood, which is on the fire. It is a burnt offering, an offering by fire of a soothing aroma to the Lord. All right, that's the burnt offering. And again, this whole section starts with that, and God spoke to Moses. God's telling Moses, this is what I want you to do. It's really this is the third time God actually spoke to Moses. You know, the first time was the burning bush. Second time was on Mount Sinai, and now here. But God is calling him out, and God is giving him orders from the tent of meeting, from the tabernacle, and he says, when the people want to come in praise, when they want to come and worship, they're going to bring an offering. And it's going to be one of 3 kinds for worship. And he said, this is the first one I want to talk about. If they bring a burnt offering, this is the way I want you to do it. And we read this, and honestly, when you read it, it's like, but that is, it's kind of brutal. You know, it's kind of graphic in nature. But God has a plan for it, and I hope that you'll pick up on it. Now, all of this, first there's a whole general principle of this. remember, these things, these offerings, these sacrifices have two principles. One is revelatory. It is God revealing something. And one is regulatory. It is God getting something out of it. And so the part of the revelatory principle of this, or why God is doing this, is He wants all the Israelites to see the necessity of a sacrifice. That's the whole principle. He wants them, as they do this, to see that it's necessary to sacrifice something to the Lord. And so He's outlined this whole system just so they can learn this. So that they can learn that there's if you want to work, there's something to sacrifice. Now, we'll keep fast forwarding to the New Testament, to our time through all this, because God He hadn't changed anything. There's still a requirement for worship. There's still something where God says, if you want to come into my presence, if you want to know me, if you want to have communion with me, there's still a way to do it. There's still something that needs to be presented. For these people, that they brought a bull or an ox or a turtle dove or a pigeon, and God said, "This is the exact way I want you to do it. Skin it, take the skin, give it to the priest, cut the thing in 4 pieces, burn them on the altar, take the entrails out, all the guts, and wash it in water in a big pot on the beside the altar, and then set it on fire and consume it. That's an offering. That's the way I want you to do it." And then for all 5 of them, He says, this is the requirement. This is the prescription on how to do it. The New Testament is different. God said, I still want you to present something. You still have to do it. There's still something you have to do in order to worship me. And He lets Paul tell us what that is. In Romans chapter 12, Paul said, you have to present your bodies as a living sacrifice unto the Lord, which is your reasonable service. If I want to worship, if I want to serve Him, if I want to be in communion with Him, I don't kill bulls. I give myself. I present myself. I say, God, here's all of me. And it's just like them. You can't halfway do it. You cannot be a Christian and halfway serve. You can't be a Christian and be halfway committed. There's no such thing as a partway committed Christian. You're either all in or you're all out. There's no lukewarm. Jesus said that. He said, I want you one way or another. And so these were given to the Israelites for them to see the necessity of a sacrifice. Because he's leading them to something. And Leviticus chapter 16 is a really linchpin in this whole progressive revelatory thing. It's going to be another step in what God's trying to show them. But He says, if you're going to do it, this is the way you do it. Now, the burnt offering, I don't know if you want to know this or not, but the Greek word is holokatoma. That sounds familiar? It's where we get our word Holocaust. The Greek word for sacrifice is the word for Holocaust. And that word means that it's a complete consecration. So that's what Holocaust was. A complete annihilation of a particular race of people. And so a sacrifice is a complete consecration. A consecration is a setting apart for God's use. And so a sacrifice is me completely setting something aside for God to use. Not partway, not halfway. Can't give God 50% and think I'm doing okay. God desires 100%. And so if we're gonna say, God, I love you, I want to be yours, then we gotta be all in. And there's a lot of Christians walking around the world, they're not all in. This is just partway doing it. You can't partway do it. You can't halfway be a husband and be successful. You're all into your wife. You can't halfway be a wife. You can't halfway be a parent. You got to be all in. Because if you're not all in, they know it, and it's just it doesn't work that way. So these sacrifices were given so that they could see exactly the necessity of the sacrifice, because God is going to continue to reveal more and more and more about it until Jesus comes as the ultimate final sacrifice, if that makes sense to you. And so this burnt offering, He said, here's the way you do it. Now, it's an act of worship, and it's also an atonement for the worshiper. It's something that is going to help him basically please the Lord. It's an act where I'm I'm going to please the Lord by doing what He says to do, just like we're supposed to do. You know, do things that are pleasing to Him. These sacrifices are designed very, very specifically. Now, look at verse 5. Let's go to verse 4. In verse 4. First of all, verse 3, he says, here's where you have to do it, at the doorway. And right outside the doorway is the altar. So he's talking about the altar. Verse 4, he said, you'll lay your hand on the head of the burnt offering. There's two reasons for that. Number one, it shows ownership. This is my bull I'm sacrificing. This is my ox I'm killing. It's mine. I didn't go steal it from the neighbor. This is mine. And so I'm possessing it, so I put my hand on it. But number two, it imputes the sacrifice. It imputes the atonement. So I'm going to kill this lamb, but the sacrifice of the lamb is now imputed to me. All right? That's why the New Testament keeps talking about Jesus' sacrifice was imputed to me and you. We now have His righteousness on us. And so he said, you're going to lay your head on it and it's going to make atonement on His behalf. Verse 5. He, who's He? The worshiper. He will kill it. The priest can't kill it for you. You got to do it. And it's done by slitting the throat. That's the way they do it. You bring a knife, you bring the ox, the bull, whatever it is that God prescribed, and you cut his throat. And then look what happens in verse 5. He will slay the young bull before the Lord. Then Aaron's sons will offer up the blood. It's only the priest that can sprinkle the blood on the altar. It's the worshiper that has to do the killing. Because it's my sacrifice. It's mine. You know, this is my lamb. I'm going to kill this lamb. I'm going to get somebody else to do it for me. I'm going to do it. It's my sacrifice. And so I'll kill it, and then the priest can sprinkle the blood. That's what we say in the New Testament. We are, we just got through talking about Baptist doctrine. We believe in believers' baptism, believers' communion with God. In other words, you can't get anybody else to do it for you. It's your sacrifice. This is your prayer. This is your act of service. This is your communion with God. It's personal to you. You do it. And so that's one reason why he says that the priest will sprinkle the blood, but you have to you have to do the killing. Now again, you just slit the throat. Now let me tell you some things about this particular offering. Number one. See how it words it? It's a soothing aroma in verse 9. When it says soothing aroma, here's what he means. It's a sacrifice that pleases God. And so anytime he uses the words, this is a soothing aroma, this is a sacrifice that pleases God. That's what that means. And so this sacrifice is one that pleases God. In other words, God is happy to receive it. Because it's an act of worship. And God is happy to receive acts of worship. And so God's happy to receive it. It is, I mean, look at the way God sees this. God sees me and you in two ways. Have you ever really thought about how God sees us? Number one, He sees us as a worshiper. As a child of God, a worshiper. Number two, He sees us as a sinner. We're both. We're two things in one. We're worship. We come in this building as worshipers. We want to worship. But we're also coming here as sinners because we have sin in our life. And so by making these sacrifices, God is delighted now that the sinner is approaching Him in worship. That's the right thing to do. Come before God in worship. That's why that Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2 is so important. That's what God says to do it. By the way, Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2 it's what I call a theological mathematical formula for finding the will of God in your life. P plus T equals W. Romans chapter 12 says that you come and you present your bodies, that's the P. I present my bodies to the Lord as a reasonable sacrifice. And then verse 2 says, and I transform my mind. I don't conform to the world's thing. I transform. I think about God's thing. And so presentation, present my body, plus T, transformation, equals the will of God. People always say, how do I find God's will in my life? Well, you got to give Him yourself first. You got to present yourself. You got to transform the way you think, and then you find the will of God. God will show you what to do. But you got to present yourself first. And so God sees us first as a worshiper, as a believer, as one of his children. But he also sees us as a sinner. But he sees the sinner as somebody that wants to be right with him, somebody that wants to make a sacrifice, somebody that wants to give back, somebody that wants to be in fellowship with him. And so that's kind of one aspect of this. And number two, God sees these sacrifices as an act of acceptance. It is, I mean, if you think about it, we do this, or they do this, because God is going to accept the offer because they do it the way he wants them to do it. He does. What happens if God says it has to be a bull, it has to be an ox, it has to be one of these certain animals? What happens if you bring a cow? And you say, well, I cut its throat and I sprinkle the blood. That's not what God said. It's not what he told you to do. Just like in the New Testament, God has a specific way that we come to him. How do we come to him? Through Jesus. You can't get to God any other way than that. You can be sincere, but you can be sincerely wrong. You can't get to heaven except it's by Jesus. That's the way he prescribed it. That's the way he did it. And so if I want to come to Jesus, I have to come to him in repentance and through the blood of Jesus. And so because we've offended God's justice, this sacrifice is a way of us saying, I know I've violated your standard, but I want to give you this in order to mediate the situation and make it right. And then God accepts it. That's the second really category about these sacrifices. Number three, if you look, in every circumstance, the offerer is going to give a life or take a life on the altar. Something dies. So something has to die. God always, throughout the whole Bible, and this is where murder and even suicide and abortion, where all this, because God claims life as his own. It's God's life. God gave it, and God will take it. God owns it. It's God's life. And so by prescribing to the Israelites that you have to come before me and kill something, make this sacrifice, then God is saying that, and it's a weird way for God to do it, but God is saying basically, you're giving back to me what's mine anyway. That life is mine. So you're symbolically giving me back what I own anyway. Which is exactly the way we are. And I hope you see how this ties into the New Testament. One of the greatest examples is when Jesus was with the disciples, they found that coin in the fish's mouth, and they said, should we pay taxes or not? Which is the big question of the day. Do we revolt against the government, or do we pay taxes? And Jesus said, whose image is on this coin? They said, well, it's Caesar's image. They said, well, give it back to him. It's his. And then he said, give back to God what's God's. What is God's? Well, if the coin is stamped with Caesar's image, that belongs to Caesar. What's stamped with God's image? Me and you. And so when Jesus said you give back to God what's God's, Jesus is basically kind of pulling back this Leviticus stuff and saying, your life belongs to him. Give it back to him. Give it to him. Sacrifice yourself. And he says, it's not out of the world. It's not a crazy request. It's a reasonable service. It's just reasonable. It makes sense because it's his anyway. And so he says that we give this life up. Number four, the fourth thing about these offerings is the animal perished completely. Everything's burned up. You see how he says to do this? Except for the skin, that goes to the priest. But everything is gone. And so by taking care of everything, everything is eradicated, everything is gone, then that symbolizes for us that there's a comprehensive nature to the consecrated things of God. In other words, again, it's everything. It's our families, it's our jobs, it's our hobbies, it's everything that we have needs to be dedicated to him. It needs to be focused on Him. Because if it's not, we're not really fully consecrated. It's not comprehensive. You can't just be a Christian at church. You can't do that. You can't be just a Christian at church and at home. You can't do that. You have to be a Christian everywhere you go. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You have to be a Christian. You have to act like it. You have to constantly present your body as a reasonable act of service to the Lord. You're constantly doing that. And that's what these offerings symbolize, that God said, I want you to burn it all up, because He's saying this is a complete sacrifice. It's a complete giving back to me, and it is it's saying I'm totally dependent on you. I mean, everything I have is yours. I'll give it all to you. And so that's the sacrifices. Now, notice what He says about the skin. Where does He say that? Let's see. Well, I lost the verse. Somebody help me out if they see it. What is it? 15?
Oh, 6. Verse 6.
Yeah, there you go. He's going to take the skin and give the skin up. So the skin is given to the priest. The rest of the thing's cut up and consumed. Again, all this is symbolic, and it's going to something. And here's what I like about this. Is because God is focusing on the inner person. And that's really what this means. That God is not focused on the exteriors. The exteriors don't matter. It's the inside that counts. It's the internal that means something. It's not just take the skin off, you'd be doing the skin. It's a symbolic thing that God is sending them to show them a point, give them a point. God's not concerned with our external stuff. I mean, He don't care what you do externally, you know. I mean, He does. He don't want you to sin against your body, but all the hoops we jump through all the time, you know, going to church and paying tithes and going to Sunday school and doing those things we're supposed to be doing. But God is more concerned with why we're doing what we're doing. Why are you coming to church? Are you coming because you really want to worship Him? Or are you coming because you want to get your way in some way? Or are you coming because you want to impress somebody in some way? Or do you just want to worship Him no matter what? God's more concerned with the inside. It's the inside that counts. That's that whole story in Samuel where Jesse goes and gets all of his sons except David, leaves him in the field because the rest of them look like kings, David don't. And God said, hey, you got this all backwards, you know. I don't judge men like you do. You know, I look at the heart of people. And that's kind of what this sacrifice is symbolizing for us, that God is more concerned with the internal part of us. Now, again, and you can see this in some extra biblical literature, like some writings from Josephus and people during the time. And you also see it some in the rest of the Old Testament, especially Deuteronomy. The higher your position, the better sacrifice you're kind of demanded to bring. Because the higher your position generally meant the more wealth you had, and so you could afford more. And so you brought a better sacrifice. So it was kind of ranked like that to an extent. But anyway, God has a specific way to do it. Now, look at the animals in this first chapter. They vary between the different offerings, but in this particular burnt offering, you can do an ox, you can do a lamb, you can do a goat, or you can do a turtle dove, or you can do a pigeon. But they're all different. I mean, the way you handle them is different between the animals and the birds. Pigeons in verse 14 was the symbol of the goddess Ishtar. So when Christians, or not Christians at this point, but believers, when they started sacrificing pigeons, it was an affront to the pagan goddess. So it upset all those pagans around. I mean, they got up to killing all these pigeons. It'd be like us going to India and butchering a cow. You know, it just wouldn't sit well with the indigenous people. But anyway, the second thing the way they butcher them, look at the difference in the way they butcher them. If you, of all these larger animals, the oxen, the goats, they have to cut them into pieces, which is practical. You know, you will handle a whole goat or a whole bull, cut it into pieces, so you can handle it a little better. The birds, he specifically said, don't cut them up because they're small. You can handle the little ones. And then he tells us that for the bigger animals, they lay their hands on them, and the way that's written in Hebrew is you press on it. It's not like you just touch it, you press on it, you put all your weight up against it. And so you're pressing on this animal. The birds, you don't do that. You don't press it because they're smaller. So there's different ways of handling animals. So, I think you see God took a lot of time in saying, when you do this, when you come before me, here's what I want you to do. The burnt offering is an act of worship in which the Israelite person sacrificed a whole animal before God. They came into the temple, they cut the throat, the priest came in, sprinkled the blood, the fire on the altar consumed it. The offering was a substitute for the offerer. Instead of me dying, I kill a lamb. It's the same thing. And they were voluntary. God told them to do it, but I'm sure they all didn't. God tells us not to forsake the assembling of ourselves in church, but we do it. We forsake it all the time. It'll come. God tells us to give the first of our income. We don't do it, but He tells us to do it. He's not going to punish us for it. We just lose blessings for not following His requirements for us. So that's the burnt offering. Next week we'll talk about the grain offering, because it's totally different. There's no animals involved, and the whole way of sacrificing is completely different. Any questions about these burnt offerings? Well, I appreciate you guys being here. We'll dismiss with our online folks and invite you to come be with us. If we don't see you, you guys have a Merry